Queen Elizabeth II spent her final days at her home away from home, Balmoral Castle, which has been a sanctuary, really, for the royal family since the days of Queen Victoria.
Queen Elizabeth spent decades protecting one estate above all others. It never appeared in headlines. It was never put on display. And for years, the question of who would inherit it was treated like a state secret. Then the answer came out. Prince William got it. And the moment Camilla's family heard that name, everything changed.
Royal families say it was a happy refuge for Queen Elizabeth, where she could get away from the rigors of royal life, where she could hunt grouse, fish.
Not every royal property makes the news. Some estates are photographed, cataloged, and debated by the public for decades. Balmoral, Sandringham, Windsor. These are names people know, names that carry weight, names that get mentioned every time the monarchy faces a crisis. But there are other properties, quieter ones that never appear in the weekend supplements or the glossy palace profiles, ones that the Queen kept so close to her chest that even seasoned royal correspondents struggled to get a clear picture of what they were worth, where exactly they sat, or why they mattered so deeply to the woman who wore the crown for over 70 years. This estate was one of those. For most of the Queen's reign, it existed almost entirely outside public conversation. It was not the kind of property that got debated in Parliament or scrutinized in committee hearings about royal finances. It was not listed among the assets that the Crown Estate manages on behalf of the nation. It sat in a different category altogether, a private category, one that the Queen controlled personally and deliberately kept away from the noise. And that is exactly what made it so valuable. It was not just the land, it was not just the buildings. It was what the property represented to the woman who owned it, a place that existed outside the machinery of monarchy, outside the protocols and the procedures and the endless committees that governed almost every other aspect of royal life. When you own a property that nobody is watching too closely, you can do with it what you want. You can make decisions about it quietly. You can protect it. You can choose who gets it when you are gone. Queen Elizabeth understood that better than almost anyone. She had spent her entire adult life operating within constraints. Every public move she made was calculated. Every speech was scrutinized. Every relationship she had with the great families of Britain carried implications that stretched back generations. She was not naive about power. She had been trained in it since childhood. And part of that training was learning that the most powerful moves are not always the loudest ones.
As the impact of the environment on human progress was a subject close to the heart of my dear late husband,
keeping this estate quiet was one of those moves. The history of the property is not uncomplicated. Like many of the great private land holdings in Britain, it passed through several hands over the centuries before landing in royal possession. The story of how it arrived in the Queen's hands personally, rather than in the holdings of the wider Crown estate, is a story layered with legal nuance and quiet negotiation that most people never heard about and fewer still understood. What matters is that by the time Elizabeth was firmly established on the throne, this estate was hers in the most personal sense of the word. Not the nation's, not the institution's, hers. She visited it often, though those visits were rarely publicized. The staff who worked there signed the kind of agreements that made candid conversations about what they saw and heard essentially impossible. The Queen liked it that way. She was known to be someone who valued privacy in a way that sometimes baffled even her closest advisors. But with this property, the privacy was not just a preference. It felt almost like a strategy. She already knew, even in the relatively early years of her reign, that properties like this one would eventually become contested ground. The British royal family is many things, but one thing it has never been is simple. The marriages, the divorces, the second families, the half-siblings, the step-parents, and the step-children. Each new relationship that entered the Windsor orbit brought with it a new set of loyalties and a new set of expectations. And expectations, in royal circles, have a way of hardening into something that feels very much like entitlement. By the time Prince Charles married Camilla Parker Bowles in 2005, the landscape of royal inheritance had already shifted considerably. Camilla's arrival was not just a romantic development. It was a structural one. She came with a family, a history, connections that stretched into the older aristocratic networks of Britain in ways that were not always immediately obvious to the outside observer.
It's always hard to choose one favourite writer because there's so many out there.
Her children from her first marriage, Tom Parker Bowles and Laura Lopes, were adults by then, polished, well-connected, comfortable in the social world that brushes up against the monarchy without quite belonging to it. And as their mother's position within the royal family grew more secure, so too did their proximity to the privileges that came with that position. Not direct claims, nothing as blunt as that. But proximity is its own kind of currency in aristocratic Britain, and the closer Camilla got to the center of royal power, the more her family watched what that power might eventually yield. That is the context you need to understand. Because when the Queen made her private decisions about this estate, she was not making them in a vacuum. She was making them in a world where every significant royal asset was being quietly tracked by a constellation of families, advisors, and interested parties, each with their own sense of what the future ought to look like. The Queen knew all of this. She knew it the way she knew most things about the people around her, not loudly, not through confrontation, through the patient, decades-long accumulation of information that came from watching powerful people operate at close range for the better part of a century. So when she finally made her decision about this estate, it was not an impulsive one. It was deliberate, it was clear, and it pointed in one direction, toward William. But the full weight of that decision and what it would set in motion would not become apparent until long after she was gone.
I'm speaking to you at what I know is an increasingly challenging time.
The Queen did not make decisions carelessly. Anyone who spent real time studying her reign would tell you the same thing. She was not impulsive. She was not sentimental in the way that clouds judgment. She was precise. She thought in decades, not days. And when it came to matters of property and legacy, she was more deliberate than almost anyone around her ever fully appreciated.
So what's going to happen to the royal estates? Well, the two properties that the Queen did own are Balmoral and Sandringham.
So, when the details of her private estate arrangements began to surface after her passing in September of 2022, the first question serious observers asked was not what she had decided. It was why. Why William specifically? Why not a broader distribution among the senior royals? Why not a gesture toward the new configuration of the family that Charles's marriage to Camilla had created? Why, in a family where appearances and diplomacy had always mattered enormously, did the Queen make a choice that was so pointed, so clean, so impossible to misread? The answer requires understanding something about how Elizabeth viewed the monarchy itself. She did not see the crown as a sentiment. She saw it as a structure, a living institution that needed protecting from the inside just as much as it needed defending from outside pressure. And structures, in her view, required continuity. They required someone at the center who understood what the whole thing was actually for.
Throughout her life, Her Majesty the Queen, my beloved mother, was an inspiration, an example to me and to all my family.
She had watched Charles for decades. She loved him, but she also understood him. She understood his complications, his passions, his tendency to let personal conviction override institutional caution. She had watched him nearly tear the fabric of the monarchy apart during the years of his marriage to Diana. She had watched the rehabilitation that followed. She had watched him find steadiness, eventually, through his relationship with Camilla. But watching someone find steadiness is not the same as trusting them with everything. William was different. William had grown up inside the storm. He had experienced the chaos of his parents' marriage and its collapse from the inside. He had stood at his mother's funeral at 15 years old and carried that grief with a composure that was almost difficult to witness. He had spent his adult years building something that the monarchy had struggled to produce for generations: a stable marriage, a grounded family, a public image rooted not in performance but in something that felt, at least from the outside, genuinely real. The Queen saw all of that. She saw it, and she valued it in the way that someone who has spent 70 years holding an institution together values stability above almost everything else. William was not just the next in line after his father. He was, in the Queen's private calculation, the anchor the monarchy would need when the ground began to shift. And she acted accordingly. The estate passed to William not through accident or default. It passed to him through a series of carefully constructed legal arrangements that the Queen had been refining for years before her death. People close to the process have described it as meticulous, every detail considered, every potential challenge anticipated. It was not the work of someone making a hasty decision at the end of a long life. It was the work of someone who had been thinking about this moment for a very long time. Now, here is where the story takes its first sharp turn. Because the estate did not pass only to William in isolation. The arrangements the Queen made also involved specific exclusions. Properties and assets that might reasonably have been expected to flow in certain directions were redirected. Quietly, legally, but unmistakably. And among the names that appeared on the wrong side of those exclusions were names connected, by family and by expectation, to Camilla. This is the part that nobody in the palace wanted to talk about publicly. The official line, to the extent that there was one, was that the Queen's estate arrangements were private matters, and that speculation about their contents was unhelpful. That is the kind of language institutions use when they want to say nothing while appearing to say something reasonable. But behind that language, the reality was considerably less tidy. Camilla's children, Tom Parker Bowles and Laura Lopes, had grown up watching their mother navigate one of the most complicated social ascents in modern British history. They had been present for the slow, difficult rehabilitation of her public image. They had watched the woman who was once described in the most savage terms by the British press become a duchess, then a queen consort. They had been at the wedding. They had been at the coronation. They had, by all accounts, come to regard certain things as settled. Not in a grasping way necessarily. Not with the naked ambition of people who have spent their lives scheming, but with the quiet confidence of people who have watched a situation develop over many years and drawn conclusions about where it was heading. The estate was not the only thing they had expectations about, but it was significant. It was the kind of asset whose transfer carries a message that goes beyond its financial value. When a property of that history and standing is directed firmly away from one branch of a family and toward another, it does not feel like a neutral administrative decision. It feels like a verdict. And that is precisely how Camilla's family received it. The fury, when it came, did not arrive as a public statement. The Parker Bowles family are not the kind of people who hold press conferences to air grievances about inheritance arrangements. They operate in a world where that kind of open display would be considered catastrophically undignified. But fury does not need a press conference to make itself felt. It travels through private conversations, through pointed silences at family gatherings, through the carefully worded observations that people in that world make to trusted journalists they have known for 30 years. It travels through the channels that the British upper classes have been using for centuries to communicate displeasure without ever technically saying anything that could be quoted directly. And it was traveling fast. The question that kept coming up in those private conversations was one that cut to the heart of everything. Had Camilla known? Had she been aware of what the Queen was arranging? Had she seen it coming and chosen not to warn her children? Or had she been genuinely in the dark, discovering the full picture only after Elizabeth was gone? That question had no clean answer, and the absence of a clean answer created a tension of its own. Because if Camilla had known and said nothing, her children's anger had a very specific target. And if she had not known, then the Queen had made a deliberate choice to exclude people connected to her son's wife without so much as a quiet word of warning. Either way, the picture was not a comfortable one. William, for his part, said nothing publicly. He accepted the inheritance. He did what the legal arrangements required him to do. And he did it with the same composure that had defined his public life since he was a teenager, standing in the rain outside Westminster Abbey. But composure is not the same as innocence. And the people watching him most closely knew that he had understood exactly what the Queen was giving him, not just the estate, the advantage. Silence in royal circles is never actually silent. It has texture. It has weight. It communicates things that words would make too dangerous to say out loud. And in the months that followed the Queen's death, the silence coming from Camilla's side of the family was the kind that every experienced royal watcher recognized immediately. Something was wrong, and it was not going away.
But she is she's our mother, and it's, I think, change happens, but I don't care what anyone says. This wasn't any sort of...
Tom Parker Bowles had spent most of his adult life carefully managing his public identity. He was the food writer. the charming, well-connected son of the Queen Consort, who had successfully carved out a career that existed just adjacent to the royal world without being consumed by it. He gave interviews about restaurants. He wrote books about British cuisine. He was good company at dinner, and everybody seemed to know it.
Cooking and the Crown, royal recipes from Queen Victoria to King Charles III, a cookbook compiled by Tom Parker Bowles.
However, behind that carefully constructed public persona was a man who understood the aristocratic world he had been born into with considerable clarity. He knew how inheritance worked. He knew how property moved through families like his. He knew what it meant when assets were directed deliberately away from certain people and toward others. And he knew what had just happened. Laura Lopes was quieter about it publicly. She had always been the more private of Camilla's two children, less visible than her brother, more guarded in her public appearances. But people who knew her well described a woman who was deeply aware of the family dynamics at play and deeply unhappy with how they had resolved. The frustration between the two siblings was not identical in its expression, but it pointed in the same direction. They had expected more, not in the way that people with no legitimate connection to a situation expect things. Their mother was Queen Consort of the United Kingdom. She had been married to the king for nearly 2 decades. She had rehabilitated her public image through years of patient, disciplined work. She had accepted every protocol, navigated every awkwardness, and delivered on every public duty placed before her without complaint. Surely, her children reasoned, that counted for something. Surely the woman who had stood at the coronation of King Charles III, who had worn a crown in Westminster Abbey, whose mother had dedicated the second half of her life to the service of the crown, had earned a degree of consideration for her family. That was the argument being made in private, not loudly, not through lawyers, at least not yet, but with the kind of persistent underlying pressure that families in that world know how to apply without ever breaking decorum entirely. The problem was that the argument ran directly into a wall, because the Queen's arrangements were not informal understandings. They were not the kind of gentlemen's agreements that could be renegotiated over dinner. They were legal, they were documented. They had been constructed with precisely the kind of care that makes challenges extraordinarily difficult and extraordinarily expensive. Whoever had advised the Queen on these arrangements had clearly anticipated that they might not be universally welcomed. That realization was its own kind of message. It told Camilla's family something that perhaps they had not fully absorbed before. The Queen had not simply decided to leave the estate to William. She had decided to make that choice as difficult as possible to contest. She had, in effect, locked the door and thrown away the key in the same quiet, precise motion. Now, here is what made the whole situation even more combustible. Camilla herself was caught directly in the middle. Her position was almost impossibly delicate. On one side, her children, people she loved, people who were angry in a way that was entirely understandable from a family perspective and entirely impossible to resolve from a royal one. On the other side, the institution she had spent years earning her place within, the institution whose rules and hierarchies she had accepted as the price of admission. She could not publicly support her children's grievances without undermining the monarchy her husband led. She could not publicly dismiss those grievances without fracturing something important in her own family. And she could not say nothing forever, because silence in that situation was itself a choice that everyone around her was interpreting in real time. Sources close to the situation described the atmosphere in private royal circles during this period as genuinely tense, not the performative tension of families who argue loudly and reconcile quickly. The deeper, colder tension of people who have discovered that they fundamentally disagree about something important and are not sure the disagreement can ever be fully resolved. William's name came up constantly in those conversations, not always directly, but he was the fixed point around which everything else orbited. He was the one who had received what others felt they deserved consideration for. He was the one whose inheritance had triggered this entire chain of events. And he was the one who had responded to all of it by doing absolutely nothing visibly provocative.
At the heart of the pageantry is a simple message: service.
Which, depending on your perspective, was either admirable restraint or a very sophisticated form of aggression. Because doing nothing, when you hold all the cards, is itself a power move. William held the estate. He held the legal documentation. He held the weight of the Queen's deliberate, clearly expressed intention behind him. He did not need to argue. He did not need to negotiate. He simply needed to wait. And waiting, for a man who had spent his entire life being trained for a throne, was something he knew how to do extremely well. Meanwhile, Camilla's family was learning a lesson that the British aristocracy has been teaching newcomers for centuries. Proximity to power is not the same as power. You can stand next to the fire for years. You can warm yourself by it. You can come to rely on its heat so completely that you forget you do not actually control it. But the moment someone else decides where the fire goes, you feel the cold very quickly. And right now, Camilla's family was feeling it.
When his father became King Charles III, he became an even wealthier man overnight.
There is a particular kind of power that does not announce itself. It does not hold press conferences. It does not release carefully worded statements through communications teams. It does not engage with the noise swirling around it or dignify speculation with a response. It simply exists, solid, immovable, utterly certain of itself. That was the power William chose to exercise in the weeks and months that followed the inheritance becoming known, and it was more devastating than anything he could have said out loud. The palace's official position was, predictably, one of complete silence. No confirmation of the specific details of the Queen's private estate arrangements. No comment on reports of tension within the extended royal family. No acknowledgement that anything unusual had occurred at all. Just the steady, practiced blankness that royal communications teams deploy whenever a situation is too sensitive to touch and too significant to accidentally inflame with a careless word. To outsiders, that silence looked like discretion. To the people inside the situation, it looked like something else entirely, because palace silence is never neutral. It is always a choice. And the choice to say nothing about a specific set of circumstances always communicates something about who the institution is protecting and who it is prepared to leave exposed. In this case, the silence protected William completely. It did not address the grievances of Camilla's family. It did not offer any public softening of the blow. It did not extend even the smallest diplomatic gesture toward the Parker Bowles side of the equation. It simply closed ranks around the heir to the throne and waited for the storm to pass. That told you everything you needed to know about where the institution stood. But William was not relying solely on institutional protection. He was doing something considerably more sophisticated than simply hiding behind palace walls and waiting for things to calm down. He was moving, not dramatically, not in ways that would generate headlines or give his critics something concrete to point at, but in the quiet, methodical way that people who understand long-term strategy move when they know they have the upper hand and want to consolidate it without triggering a direct confrontation. The estate itself became part of that process. Decisions began to be made about the property. Administrative decisions, management decisions, the kind of decisions that owners make when they are establishing their relationship with an asset and signaling to anyone paying close attention that they intend to take that relationship seriously. These were not dramatic gestures. They were not designed to provoke, but they were visible to the people who needed to see them, and the people who needed to see them were watching very carefully. Within the broader royal household, the reaction to William's handling of the situation was, by most accounts, one of quiet approval. The king's senior advisors, whatever their private feelings about the complexity of the family dynamics involved, understood the importance of the inheritance being managed with stability and seriousness. William was delivering that. He was not grandstanding, he was not gloating. He was simply doing what inheritors of significant assets are supposed to do. He was taking care of it. That competence, understated as it was, sent its own message to the institution. It reinforced the narrative that the Queen had known exactly what she was doing when she made her choice. It suggested that the inheritance had landed in the right hands, and it made the question of revisiting or challenging those arrangements feel increasingly abstract and increasingly futile. Now, here is the detail that sharpened everything considerably. Charles knew, not in a peripheral, vaguely aware way. The king had been fully briefed on the specifics of his mother's arrangements long before they became a source of tension within his family. He had known what the Queen intended. He had known who was going to receive what. And he had chosen, in the years before Elizabeth's death and in the period that followed it, to say nothing that would disturb the arrangements she had made.
My mother's reign was unequaled in its duration, its dedication, and its devotion.
That placed him in an extraordinarily difficult position, because Camilla was his wife. Her children were people he had watched grow up, people he had, by most accounts, genuine warmth toward. Tom Parker Bowles and Laura Lopes were not strangers to him. They were family in the complicated, modern, blended sense of that word. And the knowledge that his mother's decisions had caused them real pain was not something he could simply set aside, because it was institutionally inconvenient. But he also could not override a dead queen's carefully constructed legal arrangements without sending a signal that would reverberate far beyond this particular dispute. The monarchy's legitimacy rests, in part, on the sanctity of its own rules and traditions. A king who unpicks his mother's estate arrangements to smooth over a family disagreement is a king who has demonstrated that the institution bends to personal pressure. That was a precedent Charles was not willing to set. And so, he did what the institution had trained him to do. He held the line. He maintained the silence. He continued to appear publicly with both his wife and his son, projecting the image of a family that was, whatever its private tensions, fundamentally unified around the business of the crown. But projecting unity and achieving it are two very different things. Behind the polished public appearances, the conversations were not easy. People with knowledge of the family dynamics during this period have described a household navigating multiple layers of unspoken tension simultaneously. Charles, trying to be fair to everyone and succeeding fully with no one. Camilla, managing her own complicated feelings while trying to maintain the public composure her role demanded. William, present at the necessary occasions, warm enough on the surface, but carrying the weight of a position that everyone in the room understood and nobody could openly discuss. It was, in other words, a masterclass in the peculiarly royal art of dysfunction with good manners. And underneath all of it, the fundamental reality remained unchanged. William had the estate. The legal arrangements were solid. The palace was not going to intervene. And the king, whatever his private sympathies, was not in a position to rewrite history on anyone's behalf. Camilla's family had run into something harder than they expected. They had run into the architecture of monarchy itself. The cold structural logic of an institution that has survived for centuries precisely because it knows how to separate personal feeling from institutional necessity when the moment demands it. The Queen had understood that logic better than anyone, and in the end, her final act with this estate was not just a gift to William, it was a lesson about where real power sits inside the Windsor world, about who the institution chooses to protect when the pressure comes, about the difference between being close to the throne and actually being trusted by it. William had been trusted. Everyone else had been reminded of their place. The question now was what they were going to do with that reminder, and whether the fractures it had opened were the kind that time and diplomacy could eventually close, or the permanent kind. Some moments in royal history look small when they happen. They arrive quietly, without fanfare, without the kind of public drama that fills newspaper front pages and dominates news cycles for weeks. They look, from the outside, like administrative matters, property arrangements, legal formalities, the kind of thing that gets handled by solicitors in oak-paneled offices and never troubles the general public at all. And then, years later, historians look back and realize that those quiet moments were the ones that actually changed everything. This inheritance has the shape of one of those moments. Not because of the estate itself, significant as it is, not because of the legal arrangements or the financial value or the particular history of the property involved, but because of what the entire episode has revealed about the internal architecture of the modern monarchy and the fault lines now running through its foundations. Those fault lines were always there. They were built into the structure the moment Charles married Camilla. Not because that marriage was wrong, not because Camilla herself was unworthy of the position she now holds, but because blended families are complicated, and blended royal families operating under the weight of centuries of tradition and the constant scrutiny of a global audience are complicated in ways that have no easy resolution. The Queen understood this from the beginning. She accepted Camilla. She gave her public blessing to the marriage. She attended the reception at Windsor Castle after the civil ceremony in April of 2005. She did everything the situation required of her as a monarch and as a mother. But accepting a situation publicly and trusting it privately are two entirely different things. And the estate arrangements suggest that the Queen's private trust had a very specific architecture. one that extended warmly and completely to her bloodline, to the direct continuation of the Windsor dynasty through Charles and then through William, and one that stopped clearly and deliberately at the boundary where the Parker Bowles family began. That boundary is now visible to everyone, and its visibility is changing things in ways that go far beyond this single inheritance dispute. Within the broader royal family, the episode has accelerated a process of realignment that had been developing quietly for some time. The question of where genuine power sits in the post-Elizabeth monarchy is one that every senior royal and every senior royal advisor has been working through since September of 2022. The Queen's death did not just create a vacancy at the top of the institution. It removed the single figure who had, for 7 decades, served as the ultimate point of reference for every significant decision the family made. Without her, the institution is navigating by different stars. And what the inheritance has shown is that the star William represents is burning considerably brighter than anyone in Camilla's orbit had fully accounted for. This matters for reasons that extend well beyond property. William is not just the Prince of Wales. He is the future of the monarchy in the most literal sense. Every decision the institution makes today is, in some important way, a decision about what kind of monarchy he will eventually lead. Every asset that flows toward him strengthens the foundation he will build from. Every signal the institution sends about where it places its trust is a signal about the reign that is coming. The Queen's inheritance was all of those things simultaneously. It was a transfer of property. It was a declaration of trust. It was a statement about the future. And it was a very deliberate message to everyone watching about which relationships the monarchy considers structural and which ones it considers peripheral. Camilla's family learned they were peripheral. That is a brutal thing to discover, particularly after years of proximity, particularly after watching their mother give so much of herself to an institution that has now, in one quiet legal arrangement, made clear exactly how it categorizes her children. But here is the dimension of this story that most people have not fully considered. The inheritance has not just affected Camilla's family, it has affected Camilla herself in ways that may prove more consequential in the long run. Camilla is queen consort. She sits beside the king at state occasions. She carries out royal duties. She has, by any measure, achieved a position of extraordinary influence and visibility. But influence and visibility are not the same as security. And the one thing that every person who has ever operated near the center of power understands is that security, in the end, comes from the institution choosing you, rather than from the position you currently occupy. The Queen's arrangements have introduced a question that nobody in the royal household wants to articulate directly. How deep does the institution's acceptance of Camilla actually go? Not the public acceptance, not the carefully managed narrative of rehabilitation and redemption that the palace communications team has spent 20 years constructing. The real acceptance. The private structural acceptance that shows up not in press releases, but in decisions about property and legacy and the long-term architecture of royal inheritance. The estate suggests the answer to that question is more complicated than the official version admits. And Camilla, whatever her public composure, is intelligent enough to understand that. She has spent her entire adult life reading rooms, reading situations, understanding what is really being communicated beneath the surface of polite conversation and official statements. She did not survive everything she survived and arrive where she arrived without developing a very finely calibrated sense for what people actually mean as opposed to what they say. She knows what this inheritance means. The question of what she does with that knowledge is one of the genuinely open questions hanging over the royal family right now. William, meanwhile, continues to move forward. He carries the inheritance. He carries the Queen's explicit trust. He carries the institutional momentum of an establishment that has aligned itself behind him with a clarity that grows more visible with every passing month. He is not complacent about any of it. People who know him well describe a man who is acutely aware of what has been given to him and acutely aware of the responsibility that comes with it.
My own grandmother has been alive for nearly a century.
He understands that the Queen did not hand him these things as gestures of sentiment. She handed them to him as instruments of continuity, tools for the long work of keeping an ancient institution functional in a world that grows less patient with it by the year. Every asset she directed toward him was another brick in the foundation of a reign she believed needed to be built. carefully, deliberately, and with the full weight of institutional backing behind it. That is the real story underneath the inheritance dispute, not the fury of one family, not the silence of one palace, not the legal arrangements of one estate. The real story is about a woman who spent 70 years holding something together and used her final acts to make sure it stayed that way. She looked at everything around her. She looked at the marriages and the complications and the blended families and the competing expectations. She looked at the institution she had given her life to, and she made her choices, clean, deliberate, irreversible. The crown had its future, and she had made certain of it. Queen Elizabeth never did anything by accident. This inheritance was her final word on what the monarchy's future looks like. William has it now. The fury is real, the fractures are deep, and the story is far from over.